Good morning, welcome back. Pleased to be here at the Library Company and honored to be able to moderate the 20th century panel. I'm going to introduce those speakers and then they are going to do their individual talks and then we will be open for Q&A. So our first speaker is Martin Summers, Professor of History and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. The title of this talk is When Community Mental Health Met Community Control, Chicago's Woodlawn Mental Health Center and the Black Freedom Struggle. Martin Summers is a cultural historian of the 19th and 20th century U.S. with particular research and teaching interests in race, gender, sexuality, and medicine. He regularly teaches courses on post-1865 U.S. and African-American history, gender and sexuality in African-American history, and medicine and public health in the African diaspora. His current book project, Inner City Blues, African-American Mental Health and Social Policy in 20th Century Urban America, is an historical examination of how social scientists, psychiatrists, and psychiatric social workers, government officials, and community organizers understood the relationship between urbanization and mental illness, and consequently sought to address the mental health needs of African Americans in so-called ghettos. Summers' research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the National Humanity Center. Welcome, Martin. Our second speaker will be Ann Parsons, who's the Director of Public History at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Titled her talk is Asylums and the Carceral State. Ann Parsons is an Associate Professor in the History Department at UNC Greensboro, where she serves as Director of Public History. Dr. Parsons published From Asylum to Prison, Deinstitutionalization and the Rise of Mass Incarceration After 1945, which was a co-winner of the Disability History Association's 2019 Outstanding Book Award. She has worked on numerous public history projects, including the traveling exhibit Care and Custody, Past Responses in Mental Health, which launches in 2023. Dr. Parsons currently serves as Project Director for Remembering Resistance, the 1942 Ghetto Uprising, a hybrid digital physical traveling exhibition on the Jewish uprising in the Holocaust. So first I want to ask Martin Summers to begin his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this conference. So this is actually my first time at the Library Company in Philadelphia. It's really amazing space. I've done some research in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital Archives and Thomas Kilbride's papers for a book that I published a couple of years ago on St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is a federal mental institution in Washington, D.C. But this is, I love coming to spaces like this and presenting work, engaging other scholars. So thank you again for inviting me. So in 1963, psychiatrists Shepard Kellum and Sheldon Schiff opened a mental health clinic in the predominantly African-American neighborhood of Woodlawn on the south side of Chicago. Kellum and Schiff had begun planning the clinic in 1962, so its origins predated the passage of John F. Kennedy's signature legislation, the Mental Retardation and Community Mental Health Centers Act. The legislation was a result of a national reexamination of mental health care policy in the mid-1950s that was prompted by a growing concern about the decrepit conditions of state mental hospitals and the poor treatment of mentally ill people in the immediate post-war years, reflected in the 1948 film that was based on Mary Jane Ward's semi-autobiographical novel, The Snake Pit. Encouraged by the development of psychopharmacology and concerned with the deteriorating conditions of the large public hospitals that existed in nearly every state, the profession as a whole, and particularly the National Institute of Mental Health, which had been founded in 1946, began to advocate for a decentralization of the services provided to mentally ill people. The 1963 Act authorized $150 million in federal grants for 3 years for the purpose of building community mental health centers throughout the country. First slide, please. So in addition to what they considered to be a more effective provision of services, NIMH officials were also preoccupied with the mentally precarious nature of the, quote, urban condition. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, mental health experts, including social and behavioral scientists, as well as psychiatrists, were consumed with what they perceived to be the mentally debilitating effects of urbanization and urban decline, particularly on low-income communities of color. Psychiatrists had for decades drawn a causal relationship between urban living and mental illness. And as Diana Lewis pointed out in one of her answers in the last session, this was reflected in the idea that insanity was a disease of civilization, and the advancements associated with modernity, free market capitalism and economic competition, political democratization, and the creeping hedonism were sources of mental stress. It was also reflected in the medical profession, attributing the purported increase in rates of insanity among African Americans in the late 19th century to their emancipation from slavery and their movement to the city. What distinguished the mental health experts who were exploring these relationships in the 1960s and 1970s was their investment in their own ability to socially engineer mentally healthy urban spaces. In studying the identity crises that racked communities displaced by urban renewal, whose residents suffered from high levels of unemployment and received substandard services, especially education, mental health experts believed that they could make positive interventions in the lives of people as well as the evolution of metropolitan regions. Interventions that would range from psychiatric and behavioral research to urban planning to collaboration with the community action programs that were the machinery of the war on poverty. Kellum and Schiff shared this vision of the role of psychiatry as they set about designing a center that they hoped, quote, would allow longitudinal studies of the relationship between psychiatric illness and the social processes of the community, end quote. They consulted with federal officials, state and local agencies, and other psychiatrists in an effort to identify a suitable community in which to open their center. They settled on Woodlawn after being invited to Chicago by the head of the University of Illinois School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry and the chief of the Chicago Board of Health's Mental Health Division. In keeping with the principles of the community mental health care movement, Kellum and Schiff sought buy-in from the Woodlawn community. The personal investment of neighborhood residents in community mental health centers, referred to in the professional jargon of the day as citizen participation, was critical to these centers' success. Giving residents a voice in how these centers were planned and operated, rather than delivering care in a top-down, paternalistic manner, was essential to especially engaging African Americans, a population with high levels of distrust of white medical professionals. After approaching several local social service agencies, Kellum and Schiff made their strongest connection with the Woodlawn organization. Next slide, please. So actually, this is Woodlawn. So as you can see, it's right below, it's on the southern border of the University of Chicago, and this is very important here. And it was represented by the Woodlawn organization, or one of the prominent grassroots activist organizations on the South Side, was the Woodlawn organization, right? And the Woodlawn organization, next slide, please, was, yes, sorry, the previous slide. Yes, thank you. The Woodlawn organization was affiliated with Saul Alinsky, and it was very much a pioneer in participatory activism in the post-World War II era. And the Woodlawn organization was a group of activists that had formed in 1961 to resist the University of Chicago's expansion into their neighborhood, using kind of urban renewal policies, right? Kind of, they wanted to declare a significant section of the northernmost part of the neighborhood as a blighted section that they would then take over and use federal funds to redevelop and essentially expand the campus. And two, really fought back against the University of Chicago. And that's largely what two is most famously known for. In addition to its activism, not only in urban renewal, but also housing, consumer services, and education. Next slide, please. This is a slide of the image of two activists protesting de facto segregation, racial segregation in the Chicago public school system. But two also engaged in healthcare activism. It had a health committee that sought to pressure city officials to establish comprehensive health centers and local hospitals to provide respectful and dignified treatment to African-American patients, including and especially those on welfare. Two's healthcare activism included disrupting the American Medical Association's annual conference in 1967 in Chicago, during which they called for the organization to investigate a hospital within the neighborhood and to end, quote, all medical exploitation of the poor. Now, along with chronic diseases, mental health, alcoholism, sexually transmitted diseases, and environmental hazards, the 1965 Chicago Board of Health report noted that poor Chicagoans, and particularly Blacks, received inferior care and attention in the areas of, quote, mental health, drug addiction, and psychiatric care for children. Now, this was not news to Black Chicagoans, as many Black elected officials, physicians, social workers, and community advocates had long been calling for the creation of and funding for clinics, programs, and services to address such problems as narcotics addiction, juvenile delinquency, high dropout rates, and teenage pregnancy. Yet some within two harbored skepticism toward community mental health care. One of the organization's founders, Presbyterian minister Charles Labor, suspected that the proposed Woodlawn Mental Health Center was, quote, another smokescreen to direct people's attention away from the vital problems of this area, namely schools, housing, and urban renewal. In an undated document, the organization expressed its doubt even more firmly. Quote, although two agrees that certain hard-to-reach individuals and families are probably in need of psychiatric therapy and casework assistance, the truth is that the most serious and obvious causes of alienation are found in segregation and discrimination. They are not to be resolved by any kind of therapy, but by the people's militant social action, end quote. The reservations harbored by two's leaders converged with Saul Alinsky's own critique of how low-income communities and their problems tended to be medicalized, a process whereby so-called ghettos are, quote, defined as sick, the people are treated as patients, cures are sought, specialists consulted, and remedies prescribed, end quote. So medicalization was the process through which outside agents, medical professionals, sociologists, social workers, government bureaucrats, law enforcement officials, and so on, exerted control over poor people, and by which they justified that control. For Alinsky, Woodlawn's problems were not medical and therefore internal to the community. Rather, they were political and exogenously produced by structures and institutions that sought to exploit the community. Two's leaders and Alinsky shared a belief that psychiatry was not only an inadequate approach to redressing the fundamental racial inequalities that racked Woodlawn, but that it was also a tool that potentially contributed to the perpetuation of these racial inequities. The skepticism of psychiatry and of the medical profession more broadly would characterize TWO well into the 1970s. A member and one of its first historians, John Hall Fish, described the activist group as follows. Quote, as a community organization, the Alinsky-style Woodlawn organization represents a middle way between, on the one hand, the accommodative agencies that seek to assimilate the alienated into the dominant society by strategies of socialization, rehabilitation, and therapy, and on the other, the revolutionary groups that form para-communities, rejecting the values and processes of the dominant society. So Fish's framing of TWO's approach as a middle way explains in part why the organization ultimately threw its support behind the center. Similar to other community groups that pursued federal funding and collaborated with liberal technocratic experts to establish and maintain local anti-poverty programs and civil rights initiatives, TWO sought to leverage liberal sensibilities, government support, and professional assistance toward its ultimate goal of community self-determination. This middle way shaped the manner in which the activists associated with TWO and the community residents who they fought for interacted with the psychiatrists who approached them about collaborating on a center. Now, despite this questioning of the value of psychiatry in addressing the problems experienced by inner city residents, TWO did in fact collaborate with the Woodlawn Mental Health Center, appointing several members to its advisory board. Yet they sought to shape the mission of the center in fundamental ways, letting the center's co-directors know that they would enjoy TWO's support if they focused on prevention. By prevention, Callum and Shipp recalled, and this is a quote, they meant making mental health principles better understood to teachers, police, ministers, and other key people in the community, as well as working directly with people before they become ill or maladapted. However, if we were only interested in treating those already ill, then they were less interested. The community's concern with prevention led to the center's main initiative, an intervention program and research study of first graders who were considered to be maladaptive. Although it would eventually become controversial, and I'll discuss this shortly, the intervention program engendered greater support from community members because they hoped it would address the larger structural problem of unequal distribution of educational resources and improve the chances of academic success for struggling individual children. And even when the center ventured into the area of individual therapy in the late 1960s, TWO framed these efforts within a collective and political context. TWO took the lead on securing NIMH funding for a program to train and deploy community-based mental health counselors in non-clinical sites such as churches and block clubs. The goal of the program was to develop, quote, the social political structure of the community so that mental health service can be provided close to where people live. These services would be delivered by indigenous, that was the term that they used at the time, indigenous non-professionals. The most effective means of providing mental health care to communities that were at best skeptical of and at worst hostile toward the psychiatric profession was to train neighborhood residents to serve as the first layer of assistance. That these residents should be non-professionals, moreover, enhance the possibility that those needing help would be more receptive. The author of the grant proposal, next slide, was TWO's president, Arthur Brazier. Never known quite how to pronounce his last name. He offered a political analysis of both mental illness and its treatment. He attributed the alienation, withdrawal, and quote, abnormal and self-destructive behavior of some Woodlawn residents to the quote, problems that are attendant with living in a slum, such as poor housing, substandard education, unemployment, impersonal welfare, and other social agency systems and economic exploitation. As such, the program's success in assisting psychologically and emotionally troubled adults readapt to society, Brazier argued, would be measured in greater, quote, voter registration, the creation of new political organizational structures, and increased attendance and participation of citizens in community activities, end quote. So when it came to thinking about the value of individual therapy in the lives of low-income African Americans, two made a diagnosis of social ills and offered a political remedy. But I've not been able to tell whether, well, I do know that the project was funded. I just have to try to find the evaluations of the programs, which are probably in the National Archives, but I'm not quite sure which branch they are. So it's, I don't know quite how the nuts and bolts of that particular program operated. However, there's much more archival evidence of Woodlawn Mental Health Center's intervention program and research study of Black first graders at a number of neighborhood schools. As in the case of TWO's overall involvement in the center, the program was a manifestation of a spirit of self-determination, or the notion that communities that were always the objects of planning and policymaking should have a paramount role in shaping the programs themselves. According to Kellum and Schiff, the intervention program was prompted by concerns expressed by the center's advisory board, largely made up of local residents appointed by TWO, that increased high school dropout rates were the result of emotional and mental stress that children experience at a much earlier age. And the co-directors made an initial assessment of over 2,000 first graders at 12 elementary schools in Woodlawn and estimated that roughly 70% of them had failed to adapt to the school environment. This posed a potential problem of the development of mental and emotional disorders as they grew older. Initially planned to run for 5 years, and involving children, parents, and teachers from 6 target and 6 control schools, the intervention program sought to assist students in adapting to their environments through individual and group therapy, parent conferences with teachers, administrators, and mental health specialists, as well as home visits by staff. But within 6 years, the intervention program and the center that had become embroiled in controversy. In the early 1970s, a Woodlawn mother who was being trained as a mental health aide for her child's school, charged Shelton Schiff with displaying a quote, insensitivity to the needs of and problems of Black people, and doing nothing more in these sessions than treating us like guinea pigs. An African-American teacher involved in the intervention program criticized it as Schiff's quote, avowed plan to adapt helpless Black children to a system which is designed to emotionally cripple them for life, end quote. Now, interestingly, these accusations were made following a phase of the program that Kellum and Schiff considered so successful that they sought to introduce it into the control schools. Moreover, the psychiatrists attempted to give parents and educators in the target schools more autonomy by making them responsible for training the mental health teams that would serve in the control schools. Schiff later identified most opposition to the program as coming from teachers in the control schools. Quote, this general attitude of the teachers toward the program was patently evident in their early relationship with the teens, Schiff wrote. In those schools where Black militant separatism, this is his term, was prominent, it became very serious. Black team members, especially the coordinators, were accused of being Uncle Toms trying to implement a white program. Meetings were held for the purpose of creating community distrust of the school program on a racial bias, and efforts were made to mobilize parents to block the program's entry, end quote. Now, TWO's Civil Rights Committee responded quickly to the Woodlawn residents' accusations and opened an investigation of Schiff. Despite its collaboration with the psychiatrist, TWO had always been wary of the educational system's power to harm Black children, especially when that system was structured by segregation. So the committee heard testimony from a number of individuals associated with the center and the mental health seminar run by Schiff, many of whom claimed that they had been, quote, insulted or treated with contempt and a lack of respect by the psychiatrists. Reporters from TWO's newspaper, The Observer, attempted to shed light on Schiff's relationship to Woodlawn residents and did so by going directly to him for an interview. But the interview was so disturbing to the journalists that they wrote an open letter to Schiff and published it in The Observer. And this is a quote from the open letter. Some of Schiff's statements seem so derogatory to the Black community that in an effort to maintain the objectivity of the newspaper and to help him present his best side to the community, we advised him to think over what he would like to say and issue a written statement. Apparently, one of the remarks he made was that Woodlawn was his classroom, and he got his kids out studying the poor Blacks out in the street. The journalists stressed that they were not taking a position on whether Schiff should remain at the center. They merely wanted to encourage him to address the charges by issuing a statement. Schiff did not do so immediately, but it may not have mattered. Within 3 weeks of the initial accusations, TWO's Civil Rights Committee reached the conclusion that Schiff had, quote, lost the confidence of the people of the community and that they should be asked to resign from the center. Now, advocates of community mental health care, including Kellum and Schiff, recognize the imperative of giving lay people within the community some ownership over the programs that would serve them. All too often, African-American urban residents associated psychiatry with the other tools of social control that they felt impinged upon their daily lives: the police, the courts, and the prison. In short, a racist criminal justice system. As such, community mental health care had the potential of becoming just one more means of domination, along with law enforcement, schools, public housing authorities, and white business owners and landlords who did not live in their community. As the case of Woodlawn Mental Health Center illustrates, community control efforts could create conflict between professional psychiatrists and the communities they hoped to help. Now, when thinking about the place of the Woodlawn Mental Health Center and community mental health care more broadly in the Black freedom struggle, a few questions present themselves. The most pressing ones for those in the middle of the freedom struggle were, what should the goal of mental health care be? Should mental health care prioritize the treatment of individuals suffering from psychoses, neuroses, and emotional disorders, assisting them to readjust to their social environments? Or should it serve as a tool for economically and politically marginalized communities to structurally transform their condition in a larger society? If mental illnesses in low-income Black communities were caused or at least exacerbated by extreme alienation from what many consider to be a racist system, then what would it mean for mental health care professionals to help these alienated individuals achieve an emotional and psychological equilibrium in an unchanged world? As the history of Woodlawn Mental Health Center reveals, African Americans were leery of, but not completely hostile to, psychiatry and community mental health care. Like many psychiatrists and behavioral and social scientists, they too considered mental alienation, psychological distress, and emotional turmoil to be the constitutive aspects of the urban crisis. Like many advocates of community mental health care, they too were firm believers in the importance of citizen participation. Where the Woodlawn residents and activists who fought for them departed from the mental health experts was in their understanding of the concepts of urban crisis and citizen participation. When Woodlawn residents and activists thought about the relationship between mental health and the urban crisis, they certainly shared with professionals the idea that all of the social ills that characterize inner city communities, high levels of unemployment, dilapidated public housing, overcrowded and under-resourced schools, and poor social service delivery, undermined the mental well-being of low-income citizens at best and precipitated severe mental illness at worst. Whereas the professionals largely believed in the value of psychiatry in ameliorating the cyclical effects of these social ills and assisting inner city residents to adapt to their social environments, Woodlawn residents and activists possessed a more circumspect view of what medicine could or should do. For them, it needed to do more than address the intrapsychic and interpersonal struggles of individuals. Its power needed to be harnessed to foster a more politically conscious identity among members of the community. In this sense, the pursuit of mental health was ultimately or intimately connected to the eradication of structural obstacles to economic and political equality. When Woodlawn residents and activists invoked the principle of citizen participation, they also shared with the professionals the belief in the right of underserved communities to have a say in how mental health care should be delivered. For community members, however, citizen participation could easily shade into self-determination and community control. In the absence of these more militant doctrines, community mental health care had the potential of becoming just one more means of domination. It was precisely this quest for self-determination that led to Schiff's ouster from the Woodlawn Mental Health Center. Even as they recognized the potential benefits of a professional-based community mental health care model, many community members who it was designed to serve were opposed to interacting with psychiatry in ways that made them feel as if they were being scrutinized, dissected, and evaluated by outsiders. So, African Americans have always had a historically fraught relationship with psychiatry and its cognitive disciplines. In the 20th century alone, African Americans have been the subjects of psychiatric power in ways that have pathologized and criminalized them. From the 1930s to the 1960s, psychiatric examinations and mental testing were routinely deployed to evaluate Black youths engaging in delinquent behavior, leading to their institutionalization in reformatory schools at higher rates than white youths engaging in similar activities. In the 1960s, when the psychiatric profession added violence and aggression to the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, African-American men were disproportionately diagnosed with the disorder and institutionalized at higher rates than whites. During the same period, psychiatrists and school psychologists played an outsized role in tracking African-American children into special education courses. But as we have seen, or as we can see in the history of the Woodlawn Mental Health Center, despite the many ways that psychiatry has negatively affected the lives of African Americans, they have not been reluctant to engage it in order to address problems within their households, communities, and schools. What they have been insistent upon, however, is engaging it on their own terms. So thank you.
Hello, good morning. This is an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Martin. This has really been wonderful, and I know I've been learning a lot today. Thank you to the library company for inviting me here. And also, as a public historian, I want to give particular kudos on the creation of the exhibit. I know how many countless hours go into building it, and it was really wonderful to see an exhibit on mental health, but also one that was centering people's stories, people most impacted. So thank you. I also wanted to say a particular thank you to the library company, who a number of years ago, I'm not going to count, I had received a fellowship here with the library company and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to do research, which is informing in some ways this talk. So thank you. See if my slides go up. If we can now go to the next slide. I wanted to start my talk with a story. And then the next one. Oh, it's going. My great-grandparents in the 1920s had 6 daughters. I have 2, and I can't imagine 6. And one of the daughters, her photograph will come up in a minute, was Ruth, and she had severe intellectual and physical disabilities. In 1929, they really found themselves not being able to care for her. There were very few community supports, much like was being envisioned in the 1960s for people with disabilities. And so they made the difficult decision to place her in an institution, the Stokely Asylum for the Feeble-Minded in Lower Delaware. And we'll see if it comes up. A few years ago, I was actually teaching in the Danville prison, Danville Correctional Facility prison in Illinois. And I shared this with some of my students, this story of Ruth, who was institutionalized in 1929 and only left Stokely in 1969 when she passed away. Some of the students there ended up responding that she did serious time. And indeed, her story really raises the issue that asylums were playing a major custodial role in some ways like prisons in the mid 20th century. We'll see if my slide comes up.
Bear with us.
Okay, we'll totally bear with you. What I'll do is I'll talk some and then we'll go back through and take a look at some of these. So in 1955, for instance, there were 600 people per 100,000 institutionalized in mental hospitals. To give you some frame, there are almost, it's like 654 per 100,000 in our prisons today. Today, we have some of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And in fact, there were comparable institutional rates in mental hospitals in the 1950s. One of the ways I've approached this question is just as we are facing a crisis of mass incarceration today, so too in the 1950s was there a crisis of mass institutionalization. And so now I'm going to rewind a little bit to the next slide. I'll kind of catch up with the slides some. So my great aunt Ruth is sitting in the chair, was about 2 years old, and I think this photo is from 1914. Next slide. And she lived for 40 years at the Stokely Asylum. At its height, it had about 700 people, which is actually quite large. And today actually still operates, I think, although it's much, much smaller today in Delaware. Next slide. In this graph, it's showing the rates of institutionalization in mental health institutions. And here I was invited to speak about the 20th century. And one of the major developments in the 20th century is that rapid deinstitutionalization. So we see in the 1950s, it reaches a little bit above 600 per 100,000 adults, and then rapidly declines for much of the century. Next slide. In this slide, I'll explain it a little bit. The middle line, which is hyphened, reflects the rates of mental hospitalization in the 20th century. And you can see it goes up and then dramatically down. The dotted line at the bottom is the rate of incarceration in prisons and jails. And so it's much lower and rapidly increases in the 1970s and 80s. For us, as we approach this history of 20th century asylums and mental health, one thing I'd love to send you off with today as we're thinking about the 20th century is that it's critical to put this history alongside the history of the carceral state, by which I mean policing, prisons, and jails. Today, what I wanted to do is explore that history, which can feel very big as someone who's worked in it, and try to narrow it down somewhat by telling it through the history of one place, the Fairview State Hospital, which is here in Philadelphia. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Farview State Hospital was the Farview State Hospital for the criminally insane. And the story of this place, for me, reflects the ways that asylums interacted with the carceral system in the 20th century and also comprised a part of it during this time. It was built in 1912, located in Waymark, Pennsylvania, outside of Scranton. And one of the photographs that I pulled up shows a view is on top of a mountain that looks down. It's a view that's looking out over the valley. You can see it's an incredibly remote location. And then the other is a postcard from the place, which is just showing one wing of it. It had multiple wings and it's quite an imposing building, still in operation today as a prison. In the 1950s, people were institutionalized at Farview for three main reasons. The first is that people were deemed criminally insane and sent to Farview. The second is they were committed there by physicians. And the third is that they were transferred from other hospitals because they were deemed too violent or troublesome. They could be held there for many years, often without judicial review when they went in, or judicial review while they were there. In the spirit of the exhibit, which is here in Voices, I'll share a story to just put a face to that. Next slide. So in the 1950s, there was a news article that went all around the country about the laughing eel. Here, this man, Lewis Ross, ended up escaping from Farview in the 1950s. And when he was caught, the judge was asking, why did you escape? It turns out in the 1920s, he had been involved in a slew of robberies, which is how he caught his nickname. When he would have the robbery, he would actually laugh maniacally. And then he was also unusually slippery, thus the eel, like he was hard for the police to catch. He, in the 1920s, was arrested and given a sentence of 6 to 10 years. But while he was at Western State Penitentiary, he had somewhat of a breakdown. And so he was transferred to Farview. At Farview, he was there for nearly 30 years until he escaped. And so when this story came out, the judge ultimately let him go, saying he had served his time. So you can see how in Farview, sentences were actually often much longer than a traditional prison. In this way, Farview was itself making up a part of the carceral state. And this story of the laughing eel and some others, they start circulating around the country in the 1950s, or they are circulating in the 1950s, and we start to see cracks in this narrative around institutionalization. Next slide. From 1960 to 1963, there are major cultural critiques of mental hospitals by anti-psychiatry advocate Tom Saz, sociologist Irving Goffman, and Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. All of this was changing the way that people were thinking about institutions away from being healing sites to being more restrictive and oppressive. This also was a time of major changes in psychiatry, the introduction of major drugs such as thorazine, and new faith in local psychiatrists to cure mental health conditions in communities rather than far-off institutions, Dr. Summers was talking about. A major moment, which he also was speaking of briefly in the next slide, is the Community Mental Health Act. And here I brought up this painting, which shows this vision, to me encapsulated this vision in the 1960s of kind of moving away from a dark age in some ways of institutions. We see that black and white use of paint into a new age that's much more community-based. Here, it's also important to notice we're thinking about mental hospitals. The introduction of Medicare also had a transformative effect with changing standards, and also the shift of people who are elderly with dementia away out of mental hospitals and into nursing homes, which some disability rights, disability historians call a trans-institutionalization. Next slide. Another critical movement of change in the 1960s, 1970s is coming from activism. That deinstitutionalization, that rapid drop in the graph really is coming also from activists. And here I pulled up a pamphlet from the Alliance for the Liberation of Mental Patients, which was based here in Philadelphia. in the 1970s. At the bottom, this is actually the only remaining copy was a mimeograph, and so it's a scan of a mimeograph, but it's a mimeograph was the only copy left. And it's a picture of Farview at the bottom with a dead body that has a toe tag that says rehabilitated. And here we're actually seeing where a lot of this distrust of institutions are coming out. The Alliance for the Liberation of Mental Patients advocated for patients' rights and also for the closure of major institutions like Farview. It's also important to note that this mimeograph was found in the Prisoners' Rights Council collection at Temple University Archives. They're reflecting really the communications and the cross-pollination between prisoners' rights activism and patients' rights activism in this way. There's this, trying to get out of the frame of only patients' rights activism and more the activism or communications of institutionalized people and advocating for rights. Next slide. The final thing before I'll get back to Farview is I have to say, as we're here in Philadelphia, putting this history into context is a major case in Pennsylvania that starts in 1974, which is coming out of disability rights, which is the Pennhurst case. There's a Pennhurst State School outside of Philadelphia, and it was a major case in the deinstitutionalization of institutions for people with intellectual developmental disabilities nationwide. So here it's in this milieu that we have activists arguing for patients' rights, movement for community care, and this is also coming out of disability rights activism. Philadelphia is in many ways a hotbed of it around prisoners' rights activism, disability rights activism. It's a center of psychiatry. So it's a particular honor to be speaking here today. So here's the interesting thing, back to Farview. Civil rights laws were key to deinstitutionalization, and it turns out that Farview was a central site in changing civil rights law here in Pennsylvania. Next slide. There was a case, Attorney General v. Dixon, which was litigated by two lawyers with the University of Pennsylvania Prisoners' Rights Project. It began in 1969, and they created a class of people at Farview who did not have a criminal conviction, or their criminal conviction was no longer, how would you say, no longer viable, or it had expired, basically. And so they filed a lawsuit saying that they were being unconstitutionally held. The class of people was made up of 40% African Americans, 60% of the class was unskilled laborers, and many had been at other hospitals. Here, we can see exactly what Dr. Summers was talking about before, that many African American men were disproportionately criminalized and then placed in an institution like Farview, which was more punitive and violent. This is something that also Jonathan Metzel found at Ionia State Hospital in Michigan and other institutions people have seen, and is documented in Protest Psychosis, a book. In this way, this lawsuit, Attorney General v. Dixon, both was about patients' rights, and also it was about racial justice and civil rights as well. The lawyers won the case, and the commitments of 586 people at Farview was overturned. But here's the kicker, and what was surprising to me is that this case also overturned Section 404 of the Pennsylvania Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act. What is that? Before you have a chance to Google, I'll let you know. But Section 404 allowed people to be involuntarily committed. And by overturning that law, 14,000 people statewide were contacted and told that they had the choice to either stay at the mental hospitals that they were at, or they could leave. Here, as we're approaching the history of civil rights of patients, it's really critical for us to be thinking about the development of prisoners' rights and patients' rights, and how these a new concept of freedom and civil rights is being imagined. Next slide. While people were let go from Farview still was operational. It significantly decreased, but it came back into the spotlight again in 1976. In 76, there were a series of reports about Farview in the Philadelphia Inquirer. This was sparked in part because of the death of a man, Stonewall Jackson, who had died of abuse in custody at Farview. His aunt had contacted the newspaper, and Asel Moore, who's a longtime Philadelphia journalist, went out to speak with her and ended up learning about Stonewall Jackson's story. He researched this along with Wendell Rawls, and they published a series of reports exposing incredibly violent and unconstitutional conditions at Farview. The Alliance for the Liberation of Mental Patients then organized to close it down, and they were successful. Under Governor Schaap, the administration decided to close Farview down, saying that it was too abusive. Here, this was a time of peak anti-institutionalism. And I can't help it. I think I'm going to bring up the graph one more time. We can see, next slide. Here at this time, when the governor kind of finally listens and says, okay, Farview is a significant issue, we're going to close it down. This was actually a time when the number of people in mental hospitals was significantly declining, and the number of prisons was declining. People in prisons was declining. This is actually the late 1960s, early 1970s, the time, Martin, that you were specifically talking about. There's this real interest in anti-institutionalism. How can we solve problems in our communities rather than far off institutions? So they decided in the administration to close down Farview, and then another administration came into power and ultimately decided to keep it open. That was Governor Thornburg, who a few years later decided to keep Farview open. And there we see, this moment where there's this dropping number of people who are in institutions, and then this sudden spike in people in prisons. So why didn't prisons close just like mental hospitals were doing? Here, I want to talk a little bit about what happens under Governor Thornburg's administration. Next slide. Here, Governor Thornburg's story reflects this complication. He's the governor of a state with one of the largest mental health systems in the country. He's a conservative, but he's also the father of a son with a disability, and he has this personal connection to the history of institutions. He comes into office espousing the individual, the free enterprise system, fiscal responsibility, and strong state and local governments. After taking office, it's a time of major economic turmoil, and so his primary focus becomes the state deficit. He ends up deciding to balance the budget not by increasing taxes, but by making major cuts in social welfare spending. A huge area of cuts ends up being mental health institutions, both mental hospitals and institutions for people with intellectual or physical disabilities. And here, this is not just an economic calculation for Thornburg. He had a personal connection to this issue. His son, Peter, if you go to the next slide, his son, Peter, had an intellectual disability, and when he became school age, the doctors encouraged him and Thornburg and his second wife, Ginny, to place Peter in an institution. They decided not to. Instead, they placed him in a public school where there are actually quite poor conditions, and they were not set up to serve students with disabilities. Ginny Thornburg became impassioned by this injustice and ultimately became really active in the ARC at the state, national, and local levels. As the wife of the governor, she visited facilities around the state for people with disabilities. Next slide. And here in this photograph, it shows her visiting the school for the deaf in the 1980s. She recalled in an oral history interview going to a developmental center in Pennsylvania in the 80s, and she found terrible conditions there. One incident that particularly resonated is she found that there were no barriers between the toilets and no seats on the toilets themselves. he or she became quite an advocate, and as was the ARC at that time, of moving away from these large institutions to solve problems. Dick Thornburg was greatly influenced by this concept, and he ended up being a major advocate for deinstitutionalization, both as a way to cut costs and because institutions were not fit for people to be living out of at that time. As a result, during Thornburg's years in office, the Department of Welfare reduced the number of people in state psychiatric facilities by 34%, taking it down even more. And it closed no less than 6 facilities or so during his tenure. At the same time, they did put significant money into the numbers of beds in community for people with mental health conditions, and community residential beds for people with intellectual disabilities grew by 60%. For the first time during this administration, there was in fact more money going into community centers versus institutions, but it was absolutely not nearly enough. I found multiple letters from the Mental Health Association saying we need millions more dollars than what you are giving us for housing, for employment, for social supports for people who are leaving mental hospitals, and we're not getting it. Next slide. At the very same moment that Thornburg was closing down mental hospitals, he led a war on crime, which is sometimes hard to grapple with because at the very moment of trying to cost cuts, there was actually putting a lot more money into prison construction. A few major initiatives were allocating about $37 million more in 1980 to prison construction and expansion. There were also major sentencing reforms. Thornburg was a prosecutor, so limiting probation and parole and creating mandatory minimums of 5 sentences of 5 years or more for a variety of offenses. And then finally, the decision to keep Farview open, even though the prior administration had decided to close it. One other thing that happened that was important to keep in mind during this time is that in order to build some of these new prisons, the state under Governor Thornburg, but then also later administrations, ultimately took some of the old mental health institutions and converted them into prisons. There are at least 5 or 6 here in Pennsylvania that I've found, but there are many more around the state. Around the country. Next slide. These are 2 that were here in Pennsylvania. The top is SCI Retreat, which had historically been Retreat State Hospital. And then on the bottom is SCI Waymart, formerly Farview, which was converted, I think, later in the 1980s into a prison. It's also notable that on the former farmland at Farview, a federal prison was built there as well. Next slide. This is something that happens not just in Pennsylvania, but around the country. Many former mental health institutions, here we have mental hospitals, centers for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, institutions for people with epilepsy, when they were deinstitutionalized, the states ultimately were able to suddenly have access to an open workforce, land, and buildings. The states owned many of these things, and they used them to build prisons on them, ultimately really cutting the costs of building new prison construction. Next slide. Just some thoughts for today. As we look at this history, I try to think about, what can we take away from it? And for me, one thing that we take away is the importance as we work to make change, which I know there's a 21st century panel after this, really think about the importance of culture, activism, legislation, telling stories to make change. The second is in whatever work is done, really addressing the underlying racism and inequities of the systems in order to stop these cycles of injustice. And I think that that's something that was spoken about before, really thinking about what our root cause is. Third one is follow the money. right? Really thinking about economic concerns of communities that either house institutions or prisons and are going to be affected by them, but then also thinking about the allocation of resources when we have discussions about, do we have enough money for housing or for mental health services, et cetera? What are our state budgets, looking at them as a whole, including budgets that are already going to prisons and police. And then finally, thinking more broadly about what is people's access to medical care, housing, stable income, which again was talked about before. If you're interested in learning more, next slide. My book is From Asylum to Prison. And again, the exhibit Care and Custody starts traveling around the country. It's coming to Hazleton, Pennsylvania. It's going to many different places around the country. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, it's coming sometime in 2023, but you can go to the website and learn more. And with that, thank you.
For folks who were not here earlier, we will be taking questions both from in-person attendees and online, and we will be bringing around one of these huddle pods into which, if you are in the room, you will speak into so that those at home can hear you. So we'll begin. Oh, looks like.
Yes, Ed O'Donnell, and I'm from Delaware.
Me too.
And some politicians in both political parties in Delaware and my high school alma mater, Wilmington Friends School, have used unethical psychiatrists and unethical police to try to silence their critics. So we have to keep on top of this. And this includes the president and Senator Carper too. It's very, very serious. But does this go on in other states and other nations?
You're saying the unethical use of psychiatry. Oh, sorry. Here's the clarification. The unethical use of psychiatry, psychiatrists and police to silence opponents or dissonant, like dissenters, et cetera. Are there any specifics that you're thinking about? Is it in terms of diagnoses or that you've seen in Delaware? Can you tell us a little more?
Yeah, former Governor DePont appointed me to his governor's mental health advisory council for 4 years. And I'm an activist too, an outspoken one in Delaware. And I saw where they tried to get their critics involuntarily committed in handcuffs to shut them up and to, well, shut them up both short term and long term. It's a frightening thing. But Delaware is very aberrational. So the question is this going on in other states and other nations?
I don't know. I would like to think that it's not happening in the United States. I certainly, there's a history of using psychiatry to suppress dissidents in totalitarian societies. Right? I think the Soviet Union is an example of that, but I can't think of any explicit examples of that, of using that in the United States. But it's not necessarily an area that I do a lot of research in. So.
Yeah. One comment. The only thing that I would comment, I don't know the situation that you're talking about. I don't know if it's contemporary or in the past. But one thing I think is important when you see presentations like these, which both of them, which by the way were brilliant, we have to keep in mind how long ago some of the things that we are describing are, and that we don't assume that these terrible things that happened and have been, some of them addressed, some of them have not, that things are exactly the same now. Because I do think that when people learn about some of this, people have a hard time understanding how far back history is. And they also don't get in a situation like this with these two excellent presentations, what else has happened since, in all kinds of different ways. And I would say one thing I would be fascinated by actually with your graphs would also be to cross-reference them with how many people in each of the groups that used to be in those buildings now are treated as outpatients in a variety of ways, and how many of the kids are treated and mainstreamed in schools. I'm not saying how successfully, I'm just saying if we want to look at all the numbers, I think it's fair to look at all of those. But I would only caution you saying you've been an activist for a really long time. You've been pissed off at things for a really long time. Okay, but what I'm saying is we have to make sure that if we're talking about something that's happening right now, that somebody is being forced into psychiatric care or being committed, that's one thing. If we're talking about something that happened in the past, all I'd encourage you to do is make sure that we keep the past, and the present, the present. Because the people who need the care depend on us making those separations. If we aren't able to make those separations and also look at what the people who need care right now need too, I think we could be putting everybody in risk and minimizing the chances that some of this work can actually make an impact. So I would just let's be careful about, if there's something in the news right now where somebody's being committed, let's talk about it. If it's in the past, let's sort of keep it in the past. And the answer to your question is certainly in foreign countries, this happens all the time. I'm sure that mental health laws have been misused in the past in lots of different ways. That's how all those people ended up in institutions, many of whom could have been treated different ways. But the question is, how are they used now? And we should have to be very careful. I mean, I think that most people would say that it's maybe too hard. The people who work in commitment law right now, their concern is not that it's too easy to put somebody in a mental health institution and shut them up. It's that it's too hard if they are about to kill themselves to get them care. So we also have to balance those issues. Anyway, other question? Questions from the Zoom?
Hi, thank you all so much. Sorry about that. I think I really appreciate how all of these presentations have had an eye towards both the past and the present, like you were just saying, Mr. Freed. I wonder about some attention that was coming up, or something striking that was coming up from this particular panel was a notion that has persisted into the 20th century, which is labeling patients and sometimes entire communities as compliant or non-compliant. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between community-based, including communities of folks who are institutionalized or were institutionalized in the 20th century, and the desire for self-determination, as well as community resistance to some of the social ills that create some of the conditions of deinstitutionalization leading to mass incarceration.
Could you just clarify what you mean by compliant versus non-compliant?
It's a psychiatric term, or often, that's used to sort of, and is often used in a very racialized way, that refers to whether or not a patient is open to receiving care the way it is being prescribed or not.
Mm-hmm.
My focus has been more on the policies around institutions. So I'll just offer, brief thoughts, which is that the kind of on this question of community-based care and involving communities in self-agency versus desire for self-determination versus, hesitation around it, which is that, one thing I was taking away from this history doing research here was when communities of people directly affected, or when people directly affected are able to have more of a seat at the table, of the policy-making table. And here, the Mental Health Association of Southeastern Pennsylvania in the 1980s, which is good, to clarify, in the 1980s when I was studying, really advocated for bringing people who are directly affected by psychiatric disorders, psychiatric diagnoses, the mental health system into the planning process, and particularly the closure of Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. And I do think that there's a power sharing, that, one core issue here is power, and when people are given power to come into spaces, and there, in that case, although it's incredibly fraught, it was much more of an effort to try to bring people most affected into the process.
So I think I want to answer or respond to this question, not so much in terms of thinking about compliant versus non-compliant, but taking your larger point about the racialization, right? The ways that psychiatry has participated in the racialization of the particular mental disorders or entire groups, right? And so when I think about African Americans in particular, and this isn't so much connected to the current research that I'm doing now on Chicago, but is more related to the book that I was published on St. Elizabeth's Hospital. It's some of the narratives around Black insanity, right? So 19th century Black insanity, 19th century narratives about Black insanity. The previous, it was Diana Lewis, she talked about this medical consensus that existed prior to this emancipation, Civil War and emancipation, that Black people were relatively immune to insanity. But then after emancipation, you see these spikes in institutionalization, right, amongst African Americans. And so then there's another narrative that emerges that actually emancipation has led to the increasing mental illness of Black people, because they no longer are benefiting from the benevolent hand or benevolent care of their masters, right? And so they are, and they're ill-equipped to actually compete and survive in society, in a modern society, as free people. But then connected to that is also this idea that Black people, when they become mentally ill, they're more prone to, or their mental illness is more likely to manifest as mania as opposed to melancholia, right? And so I think there's very much a kind of a racial valence around that, right? So that mentally ill Black people are much more extroverted, right? Rather than kind of turning inwards and becoming kind of morose. The mentally ill Black people are potentially more dangerous because they, their mental illness manifests itself very kind of externally and outward and aggressively. And you see this, the persistence of this into the 20th century with kind of schizophrenia, right? And then that ends up contributing to the ways that Black patients are managed within institutions, within asylums, right? So in the case of St. Elizabeth's, for instance, African-American men were based in the late 19th century, were housed in the same building with criminally insane and insane convicts, even if these Black male patients were not diagnosed as criminally insane, right? Or had not, been convicted of a crime, right? And the decision to do that was in part because, they're dealing with the lack of space, right? So they've got to house these Black patients somewhere. But at the same time, it still revealed the connections between race, insanity, and criminality that, had become attached to Black people in general and Black men in particular in the late 19th century.
The one thing that I want to point out again, I'm only trying to, I've been covering mental health for 40 years. The issue of compliance for all patients and the word compliance, which is charged for white and Black people equally, probably not equally, but charged for people of all colors. People have been trying to get that word out of mental health care, I would say, for 30 years. Okay, so I think that we have to make sure that we understand that something that we are unbelievably obsessed about, upset about, that happened 30 years ago and people have been trying to make better, or 100 years ago and trying to make better, is not the same as if somebody who is a patient of color walks in today, asks for care, and is treated that way. So there's a difference between the overdiagnosis of African Americans with certain diseases in all these time periods and whether it's happening today. I would argue that we don't study enough what's happening today, and we should, in a very aggressive way. So again, I think it's important to remember that the fight against using compliance as a term has been a long time, and it isn't used anymore in any of the other medical conditions. Compliance isn't a psychiatric term. Compliance is a medication term. It refers to whether if you are prescribed a pill, whether you take it. And in psychiatry, if your other treatment is psychotherapy, whether you do it. So there are power relationships all over medicine. I'm not trying to pretend that there aren't, and I'm not trying to pretend they weren't even a million times worse before. But the issue of compliance, because I guess part of what I'm always here to talk about is I believe in medicalization. Because to me, the proper medicalization of these illnesses makes sure that the people who are actually ill with epilepsy, with bipolar disorder, and the people who have dissociative, who have autism spectrum disorders, which are not treated the same way, that they get properly diagnosed, they get properly treated. And I think we can get caught up in the politics of that and not always focus on the need for that too. So the compliance issue is an important issue. It's more in the past than you think, except all people hate being told by their doctors to do anything. All people. They don't want, and we also have to keep in mind that these issues aren't used the same way that when people were being warehoused. I said, honestly, I've spent some time watching people getting mental health care in the prisons. The better prisons that do mental health care are actually dealing with these same exact issues. There's lots of prisons that don't do good mental health care, and that's another part of the problem. But I just want to always make sure that we keep in mind what it's like for people today who have these illnesses who need help. 2.
Thank you. I have the disc. I feel like I'm going to try whoever has the stick to speak. Anyways, I'm digressing. I am Chichi Kagandi. I'm a child psychiatrist at CHOP, and it's been such an honor. I'm learning a lot. I love the history of psychiatry. In fact, we have always covered it in residency, but I want to really point out in terms of compliance and non-compliance, I beg to disagree. It is still being used, unfortunately, even in EMR documentations. That said, we are really, like you said, we're trying to transition out of those more demoralizing words, and it's all about language too. So at least a lot of the academic institutions, and me personally, when I'm teaching medical students, residents, or fellows, we really need to, I correct them in some, the compliance word, what we want to use more is adherence. So compliance by definition is more authoritarian, like you need to do this, you have to do this. And versus being a patient is really adhering to the treatment because it's the patient's choice. It's the patient that's behaving and following those. Going back to, the racial issue with the word compliance. Yeah, if a Black patient does not take the medication, they're labeled, yeah, they're not compliant. They don't care. Where I see non-Black patients, oh, well, it's their choice. it's okay, things like that. Anyways, I wanted to point that out, but love the discussion and thank you for your presentation.
It's interesting that you raise that issue, because since there is so much discussion right now about electronic medical records, you could actually say as a global thing, we want the word compliance not to be used on electronic medical records, right? I mean, it's one thing to have the compliance adherence discussion, which people started having in the 90s. It was a big decade of the brain thing, and they've been having it ever since. But as long as it's a word that's allowed and encouraged in electronic medical records, it'll always be there. And especially now, starting since April, that people can read their records, which before they couldn't, they're going to be freaked out by that word all over again. So it would be a fascinating kind of civil rights issue to say, okay, especially now that we all get to look at our records, what do we have to do to make doctors change the word from compliance to adherence as a way of sort of globally addressing that issue? Give her the pod. Take the pod.
It's intergenerational too. It's a mind shift. When I'm actually a senior attending now, but learning from the junior residents and trainees, how they are so much more socially justice mindful. It's just great. I'm so glad for the Gen Zs right now, especially in the medical health field. But you're right, in the EMR, and it's learning the language also similar to LGBTQ plus, the pronouns. We have to be mindful of the pronoun that we document, the preferred pronoun of the patient. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I really like the Star Trek. I'm a boomer, so I really like it.
There's no laser from it, though.
Yeah, no, I'm just beaming folks up. Yeah, yes, I did. My name's Rick. I'm a retired licensed social worker, CSW, whatever. I retired probably about 5 times, but in case. Back in the 70s, early, about 670, I was a grad student, and I was trying to find money anywhere, so I worked at Byberry for a stint, which I thought was, how can I put this in a clinical way? I thought it was a horrible place. And then I ended up in California after did a stint in the military, and a long stint in the military. And then I noticed at that time, Governor Reagan at the time was closing facilities. And the idea was that the folks were supposed to, as they left the facilities, then the state would save money and build prisons. And then counties were supposed to have mental health, outpatient community mental health programs and whatnot. And so, but I did see, because I got on the board of something called the West Oakland Mental Health, Community Mental Health Program, which was a predominantly Black area. But I did see that increasing homelessness of especially African Americans in Oakland, and increasing incarcerations of especially African Americans in California. And even though there were different ways to try to approach, different folks, indigenous mental health, Rasa mental health, which is Latino mental health, and Asian American groups, but I didn't see any decrease in incarceration rates, incarceration mental health rates, homeless folks who were many of whom are both returning citizens from prison and returning mentally ill citizens. It just seemed to be lost in the whole process and whatnot. And they seem to go by our initiatives. In 1990s, I noticed that our West Oakland mental health program was no longer talking to those folks in the street, but we were talking to depressed individuals who came into our offices and stuff like that. And so I just saw that as it built. And at that time, I didn't understand all of the economic connections to prison systems. and how much money was being made. And I didn't see folks getting any better, but it did seem as if I could see this roller coaster of legions of folks in LA and Oakland and San Francisco homeless, legions of many of them mentally ill. And it was at that time, well, depressing at the time. And it did seem as if it was going something without end. So that may be a downer, but that's how I kind of saw it. And California was is a huge state. They put a lot of money into different things. But I saw increasingly an isolation of the patients, and the advocates, the National Association for Alliance for Families of the Mentally Ill. Those were some cases the only types of organizations that were, but they were pushing it. But it did seem as if families were left on their own. That's my impression. That's my impression. And there were groups of mental health professionals, but I didn't really see them as really connected with patients and their or mentally ill or mentally folks with mental challenges in their families at that time.
Can I
It
ask
may be
you,
an exaggeration, but that's what I
can I ask you a question, since much of what we're talking about is race? What did you observe about the race of the different people that you're describing?
Okay, because we have
Because you're also talking about the homeless population, you're talking about, so I'm
yeah.
curious what
Sure,
your observation
sure.
was, people in care, people on the street.
Right. Considering that we have even then, a really multi-ethnic, multiracial community, African Americans, who only make up maybe 5 or 6% of the population in California, their outcomes were and their conditions were much more egregious than it was for some of the other groups and whatnot. The binary situation in which the whites are at the apex, and the idea of Latins and Asians, as they move up, they were supposed to get closer to that apex and further away from us. I thought that the situation with African Americans and Native peoples, indigenous people, were often left without care, always in the lowest income, and the types of services, marquee services that were for other folks, it didn't happen in East and West Oakland, and it didn't happen in Watts and West Fresno. That's what, yeah.
Either of you have comments about what you said?
I mean, I would say that that strikes me as a very common kind of dynamic that existed across the U.S. And again, I'll speak to not so much Chicago, but Washington, D.C. I think there's a real kind of tragedy, right, around the community mental health care model. And I think I didn't attend your talk, but it was mentioned in the opening remarks today that one of the points that you were making is kind of recognizing the disconnect between intent and outcome, right? And so I think this is a classic case. I mean, kind of community mental health care is a classic example of this, because if you look at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is located in Southeast Washington, D.C., right? One of the poorest areas of the District of Columbia, right? By the 1970s, even though it was still a federal facility, because the Army and Navy had stopped admitting mentally ill soldiers and sailors, it had become primarily a civilian hospital. And Washington, D.C. by the 1970s was a majority Black hospital, right? So the inpatient population at St. Elizabeth's was overwhelmingly Black, also elderly and chronically ill, right? So, but at the same time, you have organizations, right? Neighborhood organizations in Southeast who are working with St. Elizabeth's staff to create these kind of community mental health centers in places like public housing, right? So, and the rationale is not just provide kind of outpatient services by clinical staff, but also really educate people who are going to be working with these communities, right? So educate law enforcement officials, educators, pastors, right, clergy, educate them how to kind of provide, again, not clinically, but work with patients who, or work with individuals who are having kind of mental, who are experiencing mental distress, right? And so that was part of the community mental health care ideal, right? And then you have deinstitutionalization, and there's not a concomitant investment of resources in the community mental health care system, right? So, increasingly, you've got these individuals who are being released from these hospitals, going into SROs, welfare hotels, right? Essentially just being released onto the streets. So, and there's no support system for these individuals. In the meantime, who's now expected to be the kind of first responder? It's the police, right? And so I think that's the real kind of tragedy here, is that it kind of starts out actually as a very progressive idea, right? You provide police officers the tools to kind of deal with mentally distressed people, right? But who can then kind of get them to the help that they need, i.e. community mental health care centers. But when those community mental health care centers aren't there, where are they going? They're going into jails and ultimately into prisons, right?
If I could just add just a little bit. I was also a military mental health professional, and a soldier, sailor, Marine, Coast Guard, airman, if they were diagnosed with a mental illness, there really weren't services at that time for them within the service. I mean, you would have psychiatrists and psychologists to provide diagnosis for them, but people didn't really want to give them meds because that wasn't what a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine was about then. And then they were transferred. They said, well, listen, Sergeant, Seaman, so-and-so, you could get services at the VA. And so then they were discharged. And remember, the VA and the military did not have compatible medical records. They didn't even have compatible computers in the 80s and 90s. And so you kind of went from one system to another, which really didn't become connected until, well, the 21st
Can I
century.
ask, because I thought of this.
Where were the inpatient veterans being treated? Were they deinstitutionalized as well? Where
They would go to VA. They were VA mental health.
So the VA did not deinstitutionalize.
They would, yeah, you could go to the VA hospital. There were VA mental health facilities, like in Palo Alto. There was a VA mental health facility in Menlo Park, which is a wealthy suburb, and you could have substance abuse problems, and there were inpatient psych facilities, but there really wasn't. It wasn't until the VA, the Vietnam vets made certain types of, but that's for the 21st century. Not for this one. Thank you for the space age.
Yes, if you can be very brief, and then you have to speak into the huddle pod, and then we're going to break.
Yeah, this was just really quickly an answer to your question. My brother was released to Valley Forge out of the Army. They had a mental health place, which is still there, but not as part of the military. It's an academy now, but it was right out near Phoenixville.
One comment. I want to circle back to to something we were talking about before, and just say that one thing I found that was a moment where people were given access to services was through the courts. So the Mental Health Association of Southeastern PA ended up having a lawsuit when it was closing Byberry, literally giving people constitutional rights to community services. And, you know, on one hand, it's powerful that it happened. On the other hand, it's